everyone. Welcome to the Cosmic Matrix podcast with Laura Matsu and Bernhard Gunther. Today's topic is going to be about spiritual integrity and the importance of both inner and outer work. So we'll get to the definition of what we mean by spiritual integrity later, but let's first talk about what do we mean by inner and outer work. So let's just clearly define that, because many people think that their outer work in the world is a job that they go to, but not necessarily so. So Bernhard is going to just talk about that briefly. What do we mean by inner and outer work?
Yeah, in and outer work, we relate it to the process of awakening to become more aware. The inner work really comprises basic self-work, psychological self-work, spiritual self-work, and various different practices. To become more aware of oneself, to know yourself, to understand yourself, to work through your wounding, conditioning, programming, and find your true center within, right? To separate what is true and false within. And outer work relates to having a better understanding of reality in terms of understanding how the world works, to see through the matrix mechanisms, so to speak, through the cultural conditioning, official culture, and separating truth and lies, in the outer world, so to speak. And all of it is actually interrelated, the inner work and the outer work, because obviously, unless you have a very high level of awareness and being, you can never perceive the world or reality objectively. So the whole process of inner and outer work is to become to a more and more objective view and understanding, which goes beyond the intellect of yourself and the world, so to speak. And I want to quote Gurdjieff about this from In Search of the Miraculous, written by his student Ouspensky, where he quotes or cites Gurdjieff: "In right knowledge, the study of man must proceed on parallel lines with the study of the world, and the study of the world must run parallel with the study of man." So it's interrelated, and I've seen it in my own process. It could never be separated. But what we want to get into a little bit now, we see there's usually, generally speaking, obviously every individual is different, but generally speaking, there are certain groups of people, certain type of people who overly focus on one aspect, for example, the inner work, and completely disregard the outer world and even deny it and all of that. The outer world, the physical world, and have no understanding of how it works. And on the opposite end, other side of the coin, there are people who are extremely focused on the outside world. Especially in the so-called truth movement, becoming almost falling into the trap of the revolutionary mind on trying to figure out the world intellectually of what's going on, the matrix, the lies, the deceptions, and all of that, but they're lacking the inner work. They don't take self-responsibility. So these are the two opposites, so to speak.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to falling into one of those traps personally. I took the New Age pill, as you say, when I first got into my journey, mostly because I was feeling very amazing myself. I felt very bad for many years until I went through my own process of inner work. And then I used to project how I was feeling externally onto the world. So I think that the New Age in particular tends to focus on all is love, everything is amazing. And then they fail to disregard the fact that we're all different, and there's going to be narcissists out there's going to be sociopaths, there's going to be psychopaths. And also they don't really understand how the world works. They almost have this over idealized view of the world based on the feelings that they're focusing on. And a lot of the New Age practices are really about activating these high feelings of bliss, and they call it all sorts of different names that you'll never understand. But it's really about just getting almost a little bit ungrounded too, because yes, there is this infinite source of love and that you can access, but it isn't this heightened emotional feeling. And I think what they tend to do is also project their idealism onto the world as well, instead of being able to see reality as it is, which is the duality of which is good and bad. So I think you've also had more experience in the truth movement. Maybe you can talk about These are kind of two sides of the same coin, basically, two extremes. Like the New Age is also tends to be very focused on their inner experience and their inner wounds, and it's all really, it can be very self-centered. And then the Truth movement is also focused very much externally on what's going on in the world. And just to generalize, I feel like a lot of them don't have the balance of the inner work. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I just wanted to add about the New Age, because I also took the New Age pill at some point. The New Age deception also entails, as you said, this can turn into a very narcissistic practice about you. You create on the distortion of you create your own reality, the disease of solipsism, and all of that, meaning that you create your reality just by the beliefs you have, and you're basically even solipsism separate from everybody else's reality.
Yeah,
it's a very tunnel vision, very distorted. Not that we do not create our reality, but it's very different from the deep esoteric teachings.
Yeah, if I don't believe in it, it's not real. Basically.
Exactly. There's only my truth and your truth, but there's no objective truth, which in fact there is. Right? And it also ties to New Age deception that there's no evil. All this is love. And you said it, they use these, what I call higher truths, which are actually true in themselves from a higher perspective. All this is love and all is one. But on this lower level, everything is one, but there are vast different levels of being between human beings. Not everybody has a soul. That ties into a deep esoteric topic of organic portals. Or like you said, there are psychopaths born genetically without a conscience. We may look the same from the outside, but our internal wiring and landscape are vastly different, right?
Yeah, and love is also the ability to see things as they are, not how you would like them to be.
Exactly. And love is also not necessarily an emotion, but as it said in the esoteric tradition, love is knowledge. Love is not intellectual knowledge, but a deep understanding to see things as they are, right? So, with regards with the so-called truth movement, well, it's kind of tricky because I don't even see a truth movement. I'm certainly not part of any movement, but just to define it, the truth movement, generally speaking, is like people who just, in a positive sense, speak out about the atrocities in the world, how we're being lied to, the lies of government, or going deeper, secret societies, Illuminati, how we're being manipulated, chemtrails, geoengineering, and even going even deeper, even the hyperdimensional aspect and alien and UFOs, what partly I talk about. But I've noticed, and I've been at a few conferences and speaking at events where the very popular figureheads of the so-called truth movements, and it's very well attended. It's fun to be around there. But what I've noticed, again, I'm talking generally, so it's not everybody fits into that, but generally speaking, a lot of these people, they're overly focused on the outside world. Right. And I've sensed even energetically a lot of these, the people, they're not very embodied.
They're not taking care of themselves.
Not taking care of themselves on all levels, even on the basic physical level,
with
basic diet, exercise, and let alone on the emotional level. I've noticed a lot of the amazing scholars and intellects have a vast understanding of how, quote unquote, the matrix works, mostly only on a 3D level, but can easily get triggered, shadow project, and sometimes have the emotional intelligence of a 10-year-old, no disrespect, but, there's a certain spiritual maturity missing, and it shows that there's a lack of sincere inner work, and everything is externalized and then most often fall into the blame trap, victim trap, or what Gurdjieff called the trap of the revolutionary mind, and then feed into the divide and conquer frequency from the hyperdimensional perspective, even to the point of projecting there, we must kill all the psychopaths and evil, the trap of eradicating evil, not understanding that evil is also expression of divine God, experiencing itself subjectively, the dark side of creator, but it's part of duality. You cannot have one without the other.
Yeah.
But the process of awakening is through the inner work to transmute your inner life, to unite the inner male and female, to transcend you and transmute duality. So you're beyond dark and light, right? You're not attached basically to either side, even the political spectrum, you see it, People easily identify themselves as whatever particular side, or they identify themselves even as anarchism. And the moment you identify yourself with something, it creates the opposite. There's no anarchism without statism. One defines the other on an opposite end. So that's why, again, going back to the topic, it's really important to have both integrated. And on the opposite hand, with people who are, let's say, overly focused of inner work, we see this not only in New Age, but also in let's say, mainstream yoga in the mainstream yoga world, the yoga community,
and mainstream psychology
mainstream
as well.
psychology, mainstream pop spirituality, you know, a lot of very popular authors out there who have no understanding of the world out there, of the matrix, how it works, and actually feed into most often the New World Order, socialist, Fabian agenda, Tavistock, Frankfurt School. Research that if you want to understand what's going on the basic level in the 3D world. And it shows itself in this NPC, non-playable character behavior, right? The tram bashing and all of that, like the liberal, progressive, self-righteous social justice warrior. But then without understanding how the matrix works, they feed into the divide and conquer. They feed into the matrix, and they're being controlled by forces they have no awareness of and even deny, even though they have the inner work, right? Inner work in terms of just basic psychology or spiritual work.
And sometimes you can have all the understanding on the psychological processes and the yoga theories, but I mean, before I practiced yoga, I think it was just a common understanding. There was a lot of yoga teachers out there who were still assholes, who were giving yoga a bad reputation, because it's like, why, you know, they're doing this amazing spiritual practice, but why is it so? And it's because they weren't actually able to apply all this knowledge to basic everyday circumstances. And I think that that's a challenge in itself. Like, we all get caught up in our own things, but you have to maintain the sincere effort all the time. And I think especially with yoga in the West, like, a lot of people got into it at the right time, at the right place. They also got into it because they knew, I think, they could benefit financially from it, and then their ego started feeding off the fame. So that in itself became a derailment from maybe what was a sincere interest to begin with. And also, you know, like, as much as I like how they've brought in the neurobiology of meditation and yoga, it's also important to have these fundamental spiritual values that carry your practice and be able to practice them in the world. And that's easier said than done too, because in order to really demonstrate kindness to the world, you have to get rid of a lot of your shit that's in the way of doing that. It's not just being like, oh, just smile at you and be happy and like bow and say namaste. Like, it's not, that's how you can inauthentically do it. But in order to be truly kind, I feel, and demonstrate this compassion that they talk about in the spiritual circles, you have to get rid of everything that's in the way of you being genuine to others. And that's all the lies you tell yourself, all the self-deception, all the ideas on who you think you are. And that's the hardest work of all. So, yeah, I think other than like the New Age and Truth movement as two extremes, also there's this balance of doing inner and outer work. Like, as you do more inner work, you can't just do the inner work in a cave in India like they used to do. Well, you can, but I don't think it's very effective. It's also learning how to be in the world and learning what to understand the world as well. And like, I think it's normal for us to want to project our own experience onto the world at first, but then we learn to see that not everyone is having that experience that we are having, and not everyone is the same. Like, I remember when I was first kind of accessing these different states of consciousness, I guess you could say, I would automatically think that like, oh, you know, I'm feeling, it was a New Age deception and being like, oh, the world is a mirror of me all the time. I would think everyone was sincere in their spiritual process. Everyone wanted to face their shit as well. And that just didn't turn out to be true. And I learned that from experience too. And also, you know, just not, that also was not an act of love in itself to see people for differently than how they were. So, do you want to talk more about this kind of lack of being and understanding you see in popular spiritual teachers these days?
Yeah, let's talk about what you just alluded to as well. Maybe we talk about, you know, like the title of this podcast, spiritual integrity, and what actually integrity means.
Yeah, so the definition of integrity is, sorry, I'm just pulling it up on my phone. It means wholeness, essentially. There's a couple major definitions, but one of them is the quality of state of being complete or undivided. And then there's another one, which is a firm adherence to a code of especially moral or artistic values. And like, a lot of atheists think that like morality is subjective, but I don't feel personally it is. Like, I think that you can also, that's a sense of knowing, like you can know when something is right or wrong. Like if I do something terrible to someone, my level of being, if it's evolving, will be able to recognize that. And I can feel like healthy guilt, as they say.
The basic function of true conscience.
Exactly. And then the quality or state of being complete or undivided. And in Shongyang Trungpa Rinpoche's book, he talks about how you have to have that union of body and mind. They talk about, yoga even means union of body and mind, but that means like, I feel like when we have any time that anything is not going right in our life and we're getting frustrated, there's a basic fundamental lack of that union. And I think that that's also shows externally in people who, like they have, I know I've been guilty of this and it still happens to me. They can have this amazing meditation or yoga practice, but then they leave rude comments on people's Facebooks in their spare time. So there's not an alignment there. So what do you feel the definition of integrity is personally?
Personally, in my own life, staying integrity, meaning, being true to yourself, which is slippery slope because who is the self anyway? Most often people mistake their conditioned, programmed self or justify it as opposed to their true self beyond the masks, wounds, and conditioning and programs, which we all have to varying degrees. But, speaking out of my own personal experience and life, it's also what is the intention in life, especially when you start engaging in spiritual practice or self-work or want to learn about the world. Why do you do what you do? And as I mentioned before, my work started because of deep suffering. I truly needed to figure myself out, to learn, understand myself. Otherwise, I would have died, literally killed myself, and understand the world because the world doesn't make sense. Question everything I've been taught and told. So I had this sincere intention from early on to wanting to understand the world, to not leave any turn to
stone
unturned. To not leave any stone unturned, and not shy away from looking into any topics, even topics that are deemed taboo, and also speak out about them. That's been my path. And I started, I've never planned consciously to have this as a quote unquote career, to be a writer or coach in the work I do helping others. It just came out of my own sincere drive to wanting to understand myself and the world, and then speaking out. I never cared about what other people really think about me. I never cared, I never had, any concerns in terms of like, oh, is this going to affect my career negatively if I talk about this or my work? No, like it was about conscience. It goes back to the word my conscience. Like especially back in my days when I was more like, I'd also, for me, in and out of work were always deeply intertwined, but at some point, definitely, it was also more the truth movement naturally because, as the saying goes, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And, listening to Rage Against the Machine and fuck the system, but going even deeper and wanting to spread awareness about these topics, even about extremely taboo topics, which a lot of people shy away from because they're afraid of the repercussions, what other people may think about, and they get trapped within the matrix thinking because then their career, their bank account, their success, whatever in status is for them more important than truth. So that's for me being out of alignment with integrity, not being truly in integrity. And people can still lie to themselves why they do what they do or deny certain topics they have never really sincerely looked into. But I see this a lot, especially in the yoga community, in like more mainstream pop spiritual community, and all of this, there's the avoidance of tackling topics that may be bad for business, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a similar journey as you as well. I thought I was like a rebel punk rocker in my teenage years. I read Adbusters very young. Like I found it when I was 14. And it immediately just made sense. And I saw through the deception of how the media manipulates us constantly and how we're just being brainwashed all the time. I also had experiences in a psychiatric ward that did the MK Ultra experiment. So I had some pretty direct experiences with everyone does, but some aren't able to see it, with just the lies of the world very young. But I was completely lacking the inner work. And even though I read Alan Watts, I had zero spiritual practice practice back then. And that was really my own journey. So it's interesting to see how it almost goes in certain phases. It's not like you have to constantly be focused on inner and outer work at the same time, but it's like a dance you do. It's like you create this more inner understanding. You also compare it to the world, because we also can't understand our own inner work until it's practiced in relationship with the world as well, and engaging with the world, because that's what really truly holds the mirror up to us. And I know my own spiritual integrity. The reason, interestingly, you talk about suffering too, that was also the reason that my own journey started. I remember after I had like my like quote unquote big awakening experience at the end of 2012, I remember picking up this book jokingly, but not so jokingly. It was like 101 Ways to Avoid Reincarnation. And I was just realizing, it was like, oh my God, like I got to figure this out, or else I'm going to not only have to go through the same patterns in my day-to-day life, but I'm just caught in this like loop of suffering I could see just within the patterns of my own life. Not obviously, I'm not referring to remembering my past lives or anything. I was just like, I just need to get out of this loop of suffering the same patterns over and over again, because it was really painful. So that's where my own journey started. But then similar to you, I just started putting information out there. I had like social media accounts. I was posting information. I was like putting it with images. It was also a form of like my own artistic process as well, like sharing this information with people. It's like, oh, how beautiful it is. I could present the information that I'm learning about with other people. I thought it was amazing. And then quickly I started writing a book, and then my ego got caught up in it, because I was like, yes, if I get a publishing deal with my second book, I can, use this as a quote unquote career. And then my Instagram got popular. And then it was like, that actually kind of terrified me too, because I think on a soul level, I could see how these temptations were trying to kind of derail me, and which it did. Because at a certain point I remember, for at least like I would say a year, but like censoring myself constantly, being like, oh, like, like what do people like what's gonna, like thinking about, and I think it's important to consider the other person, but I was really censoring what I was going through, because I wanted to be more popular and be more accepted by people and not be truthful and authentic. So I derailed from my path that I started on to begin with by getting caught in these temptations. And I think easily, since spiritual materialism is a big thing in the West these days, and everyone's into like either yoga or meditation or shamanism or some form of these neo-tantric traditions, like there's endless amounts of spiritual avenues that you can get distracted by. And I find that a lot of people who has these experiences, they come from the sincere, I think for many of them, I'm just maybe assuming it comes from the sincere wish to share what they've learned with other people. But then very quickly, I think people want to turn it into a career and a way to make money. And not to say that it's wrong to make money from what you're doing. I think everyone wants to have ways to be more of service to other people, and through not having to work in some crappy day job in an office, that gives them more time to do so. So there's a careful balance in that, because a lot of people still think that all spiritual knowledge should be quote unquote free. And by the way, many of it is out there and very cheap. But if you want to learn from a spiritual teacher who can accelerate your progress in a retreat, and they put all together their information for you, then that's going to, it's like you're paying for a little bit of a shortcut, essentially.
Yeah, that's a very important point, that balance, because there's definitely the greed aspect or the temptations of the matrix, which are usually greed. The love for money is the root of all evil, not money in itself. That's just energy form we agreed upon to exchange with. Sex, appeal, and all of that, and then obviously fame, right? But again, from a balance point, there's nothing wrong with being more popular, reaching more people. There's nothing wrong as sex per se, to approach it consciously, not to being like a slave to it, so to speak, or use it for manipulation. Also, or with greed, like you said, there's nothing. We want to make this clear. There's nothing wrong with making money out of what you love, or with teachings and all of that. If it's in integrity, if the drive for money and material success doesn't override your own inner sense of truly being of service, and your inner alignment of presenting your gifts and talents, which is different for each of us. And it's pretty normal to use money as an exchange and all of that. So that's a really important point. But what I've noticed, and I had several incidences, which I want to get more into these cases in the second hour. But for example, of some prolific spiritual author got on my case because I was speaking out a few years ago against the atrocities of Israel, against Palestine and Gaza and that genocide that's still happening. And he was a full-on actually Zionist supporting Israel and putting down Palestinian, literally buying the completely distorted official script, right? And it was really astonishing because I liked this author for so many years. He was really, cutting through the New Age and is an excellent writer. But I also noticed just because you're a good writer, have good intellect, and have some sort of understanding of the spiritual process, doesn't really imply that you have the level of being or awareness of what's going on in the outside world. And I'm still conditioned by that, right? But what I also want to mention is like what you just said as well in regards to the temptations, what you have experienced it. And I myself too, as I became more quote unquote popular with my work. And I just, I was never pushing myself out there. The work just mushroomed by itself. Like I was just being true to myself, and followers of my work know that I talk about many topics that, won't be presented on TED or Oprah anytime soon. But, I made this documentary, that film with my friend Umberto, Love, Reality, and Time of Transition, in which we also point out what you mentioned before, the New Age fallacies and all of that, right? So I was approached by this producer / writer who was pretty well known on the Burning Man community and has released some documentaries and had some great connections. And he really loved my work. He was ego stroking me and all of that, and wanted to involve me in the new film, documentary he was making, about trauma and healing and the deception of the New Age, and how the New Age approach can most often does more harm than any good, and spiritual bypassing and all of that. So he wanted to, quote unquote, basically hire me for that section, even made me co-producer. And I remember back then how also it appealed to my ego, right? I have to be honest about it. I was like, yeah, that would be a great connection to have. He also promised he would get me on a speaking tour with him so I could reach more people, So, and I also believed in the project. But then it's interesting what happened as I got more, interested and started working with him. All of a sudden, he became very controlling. And it turned around, like it was almost like the typical narcissist approach, ego stroking.
Yeah.
Luring me in, and then, trying to control me. And basically the way it showed itself was that he then started to tell me what I should or should not talk about on Facebook, for example. Certain topics, like he said, don't talk about this alien hyperdimensional stuff, otherwise you won't get any investors. Back then I was doing deep research into history, World War II and all of that, and questioning some aspects of it just out of basic research, right? He don't do this, because he wanted to get money from investors, and, that's when I realized okay, I'm not in integrity anymore, right? I would have to sell my soul.
Did you take his advice?
I did not take his advice. I was really at this point, I was clear, okay, I cannot do this. And I really wrote to him, sorry, I cannot censor myself, right? I need to stay true to myself, and I can't be part of your documentary anymore. And interestingly, then really whatever force has been working through him from ego stroking me and being all over my work, then he turned the opposite and started gossiping about me, attacking me on Facebook, and all of that turned into the exact opposite, right? But it was a big teaching lesson not to get lured in by these temptations. And I've been also invited into certain festivals I declined to go to. There was this one big festival, the Oregon Eclipse. Yeah, remember that? I think that was last year. Yeah. It was a huge festival with 20,000 people, and I got approached one of the organizers for me to talk there and would pay me and all of that. But it just didn't feel right to present my work at a festival like that, right? With many people tripping during the eclipse, with, a lot of people know the issues of the moon to begin with. Part of me was, again, not part of me, but the ego was they could reach more people, get paid, and would be good for my popularity. But deep down inside, on a deeper soul level, I felt, no, this is not aligned with who I truly am, right? It was another, so I declined as well, right? For me, it's quality over quantity. I never apply to any festivals. I never push myself onto podcasts. I do only people come to me and invite me, and then I decide based on my conscience, based on my internal, how I truly feel, if I say yes or no.
Yeah, that reminds me too, like when I was being tested as well, what was really a turning point for me, I'm sure some of you have seen this movie where Jim Carrey plays Andy Kaufman on Man of the Moon, and Andy Kaufman was like this famous comedian slash actor. He had his own television show and had his own show on Saturday Night Live. And I think it was during his television special, they basically wouldn't let him take creative control over it. And at that point in the movie, I think this happened in real life too, he quit the movie and decided he would just wash dishes. Like, so he went from being this huge superstar and being like, you know what, I don't care if I can't do the way I want to do it. I'm just going to go back to doing that. And I had that moment too, where I was like, you know what, like as long as I can express myself authentically, I don't care if I get like a crazy publishing deal or become more popular. I'll do whatever I need to do in order to support my own process. And I don't like, I think caring about suddenly like making money off of what you're doing or something, that's a trap in itself as well. Like and I think it's really about being able to do the work and even do it for free if you have to in the beginning in order to gain that experience and not automatically try and monetize it. So, because I see very often like coaches or, you know, different spiritual coaches, they'll do like this course and all of a sudden they'll just start charging like $500 to talk to them for an hour. And I'm not saying that they don't have skills, but I'm just saying that you can see that there's an element of greed in there and not wanting to be truly of service. And, you know, like, and I think the whole idea, like pay what you're worth, is like this ego trap to begin with. Like, I think you should also pay what feels right to you. Yes. But then also put your prices on what you intend to teach and what value you think you're providing people, not what your ego thinks it's worth.
Yeah, exactly. And then you know, on that topic, you know, a lot of people also suffer from, myself included, especially in the past, scarcity consciousness, poverty consciousness, not knowing my worth, feeling bad for charging people. Actually, that's been my longest trouble, because I also, you know, was influenced by distorted spiritual idea that, you know, service to others should be free and like, you know, it's give,
yeah,
and not, you know, not getting anything in return, which actually I realized later on in my studies from esoteric perspectives is a violation of balance, right?
Yeah.
It needs to be give and receive, right? And the scarcity consciousness, poverty consciousness is in fact is also a matrix program, which I feel a lot of people in the so-called truth movement fall into that trap and blame, you know. Once I started, you know, my work with coaching, for example, it's like you said, it was not like I started my work like, how could I make money? You know, like it just, you know, the universe presented it. It was like answering the call. More and more people were asking me questions and all of that. So I'm investing a lot of time, you know, responding to emails when it came to a point like, okay, I need to be you know, I need to basically charge something because I invest a lot of time, energy, my experience and all of that. So naturally I started my coaching services and all of that. Or, you know, the big one was the webinar, for example, which is available on my website, 8-hour webinar on occult force interferences, which took me, like you have been present through the process, hundreds of hours to compiling it all and putting it all together, 140 slides. And like, yeah, I'm going to charge for that a certain amount. And people got upset about me, especially from the so-called truth movement, you know, projecting on me that I'm greedy and all of that. So that shows their own programming. Again, the trap of the truth movement, like, you know, falling in the victim blame trap. Right. And the opposite side is the other extreme, is when you fall in greed, when you all of a sudden you lose integrity and all your work is just, how can I make a buck out of everything?
Exactly.
Right. And then I see a lot of people who are actually more gifted, have a lot of talent in marketing themselves more than actually the topic, any experience, understanding of the topic they're trying to teach.
Yeah, and interestingly, this also ties in with the both inner and outer work too, because I find there has to be a balance. Like you also, like you and I both provide a lot of free writing to people for free. We put a lot of resources out there. However, if you want to have a personal one-on-one session with us, then you're going to also have to pay the fee for it. Like that's just the way it works. And we provide a lot of free information out there. And it's kind of, I see a lot of people who basically hide all their, or they don't even do that at all, but hide all their information behind a paywall, which I think, you know, it's about creating that balance as well. Because I think if you're truly passionate about something, like that's what I noticed too. It's like, I could like be like, you know, everything into a book and be like, you have to buy this book in order to get this information. But I'm so passionate about sharing this information of others because it really comes from a place of wanting to be of service to others. And I also understand that it's not just me who's going to get enlightened all of a sudden. It's going to be a collective experience. Like as you help others, you help the world. And it's just this constant exchange. So I think that that's really important. It's like not only with our both inner work of what we're doing internally, but what we can offer the world. And then also, like having different things available to people. Yes, having free information and not being like, you can only talk to me if you pay me kind of attitude.
Exactly. I mean, same for me. I mean, obviously for lots of my work now, there are, 50 articles, essays. I've put a lot of work and research into it, all interviews, lots of films, panel discussions, but even, speaking of charging, the second hour is only available for members, right? Mm-hmm. Because we also want people who are sincere, and in the second hour we go deeper, talk about stuff we necessarily maybe don't talk publicly, and then also access to the forum, which also people don't understand, like even the member section, also it takes time, effort, and money to keep it up and running, especially with the podcast and all of that. It's our time. So it comes down to balance, right? Mm-hmm. And really like understanding that nature is also abundant. And, it's a fine line, not falling into poverty consciousness, but also not into greed, basically. And that goes back with the inner and outer work. Right?
Yeah.
Do we...
So let's also get more into this topic of like how this also relates to exposing our inner shadows, and then how that exposes us to the shadows in the world. And then also conversely, like once we start to anchor more of this divine light within us, then we can also experience the world in a more positive and uplifting way. And just in relation to like my own personal experiences, I think just on a basic level, I've seen that the more like shadows I uncovered with myself, the more light I could anchor once I did my work. Yet also externally, that relates to the world. Like if there is really no difference of the world as it being a mirror, there's also going to be shadow aspects in the world which we need to face and confront and deal with. And then that gives us the possibility of anchoring more light into the world. So maybe you can share some of your own insights about that. I'm sure you've been through a lot as well.
Yes. So it also goes back to what we talked about, integrity, and what I mentioned before, conscience, just basic conscience or consciousness. And let's look at the basic definition again. The word conscious or consciousness refers to an individual sense of recognition of something within or without oneself. It comes from Latin conscious, knowing, aware. To be aware or awakened to an inner realization of a truth. It also relates to the word conscience. The word conscience, etymologically speaking, means to know together. It is derived from the Latin prefix con, which means together, and the Latin verb sere, which means to know, to understand. So basically, therefore, a development of evolution of consciousness means knowing more together, seeing things differently than previously known. In other words, the evolution of consciousness really implies working or progressing towards a higher state of awareness to become more objective within ourselves, to the inner work, and objective with regards to the world out there.
And I know I also fell into like the patterns of like the NPC trap as well. But interestingly, like as I worked in my own meditation and yoga practice, one of the signs that it was working was I couldn't resort to the old, like I used to be very into like protesting for Indigenous rights. Not that that's not important, but all these things just stopped. It didn't resonate anymore. And I realized more and more like just I was projecting a lot of my anger and pain and frustration outwards. And I think the way that you can tell your spiritual being is evolving is what used to resonate will no longer resonate. And even if intellectually, if your mind is trying to argue with you about it, something will feel off.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really what it comes down to, because this awakening process is truly a twofold process of the inner and outer work, right? And, again, the inner work relates to basic esoteric or psychological spiritual work to dislodge any social, cultural conditioning and programming and healing or transmuting trauma and wounds in order to, quote unquote, grow the soul. That's the true meaning of embodiment, and bring the soul to the front and clearing the ego personality to make the ego a servant for spirit to align with divine will, right? But the outer work then relates to also training the mind. That's a big issue. You see a lot, especially ironically in a lot of pop spiritual or even the yoga community who are really NPC, liberal type people, or in the New Age, they lack the basics of critical thinking, of knowing how to use the mind. You know, in distorted spiritual teachings, the mind is demonized. Yes, in meditation, we need to get out of the mind and thoughts, but it's still, if you study any true esoteric tradition, they emphasize about, you know, using the intellect like an error, like sharp, like aligned with higher knowledge gnosis, right? And be discerning, right? So
yeah, the discernment is also key, is developing that discernment.
Exactly. It's to separate truth and lies from in the world. And, you know, this process is different for all of us. And it doesn't imply to become a scholar in terms of how the world works. That's impossible anyway. But it's a mutual inclusive process, right? And again, it goes even back to any, you know, spiritual esoteric teachings. A lot of it has become very distorted, edited, suppressed. You know, suppression of knowledge is the name of the game, or oversimplified. Especially in the West, we see this in yoga or pop spirituality. In all of that, even psychological processes have become very oversimplified. But when you really study the complete esoteric teaching, does not only show you the inner work of how to escape Maya, the world, the matrix, and find the divine within towards self-realization, bliss, joy, quote-unquote, enlightenment, but it also teaches you about the reality of the world, quote-unquote, out there, and the traps therein, including how the works, forces, even occult forces. Any complete esoteric teachings talks about the hyperdimensional matrix in its own words, right? But even on a basic 3D level, it means to understand, you know, questioning the world. And it's, for me, such an oxymoron when a spiritual teacher or popular spiritual teacher, you know, supports a political candidate and buys into the political illusion, to buy into statism and believing in government, in this, you know, archonic creation, and not questioning it, right? And feeding into the divide and conquer frequency. It's very, very fascinating. And similar to you, when you mentioned earlier on, you know, in your journey first, you always kind of soul projected onto others that everybody would be questioning this and, like, you know, and be in the same, you know, engage in the same process as you do and be sincere about it. But it's not the case, right? I've noticed it early on when I got into these topics, like, how can you not question the world? I was like, everything is a lie. It's so obvious, right? How I've been lied to, until I realized, yes, we are one, but we are not all the same. And for some people, they are not even in the level of being to question anything, or you know, to even be able to do this from a soul level. Yeah, and there's also I guess the opposite side of that coin, as you see in the truth movement. Sometimes there's this like overly paranoid and overly hostile view of the world, and then they're also not able to recognize compassion for others, and it's just constantly blaming, being paranoid of entities or forces acting through people, and that's the other side of the coin. So it's important to have that balance, you know, like, just as much as you need to observe people for their actions in the world to really find out who they are and get to know them, you also have to develop, like with your own spiritual practices, trust as well, that life is going to serve you whatever it is you need to learn in order to evolve, and not just be constantly looking for issues, but then also not be constantly looking to find people in their idealized self, which is just projecting these positive qualities on them that they don't have. And that's kind of also developing not only the objective witness with ourselves, but the objective witness with other people. Yeah. You know, it goes back, that relates to the esoteric triad of knowledge, being, and understanding, right? Because just intellectual pursuit of information, you may intellectually understand how the world works, matrix, to a degree. You know, again, the goal is working towards more objective view of self and the world. We cannot possibly be fully objective to see the world as it is in our state of being, right? So it's always a progress. It's always a work in progress, right? Like, I don't claim, and I'm not sure you don't claim, to be awake in the true meaning of the word, like woke as fuck, as the kids like to call themselves in this day and age, which is such an overused word to begin with.
Yeah, and now it's also being misappropriated. Like, people think being like woke as fuck is like like kind of this toxic feminism and calling out like this toxic masculine, and that's also externally, and it's almost like that's the whole just ego thing to begin with, and be like, I'm more awake than you are, which interestingly, in my own, like I went to a 10-day silent meditation retreat. That was one of the first lessons I was handed, because I had already had experience meditating or whatever, but that doesn't matter. But one of the first things is I encountered was my own spiritual ego, basically, where I was like, oh my God, like I'm able to access deeper states of meditation than people. I'm so much more advanced than other people. And then I saw how automatically through, and that may be true, but that doesn't even matter at all. Like it doesn't, like your level of, like it's also the level of being and being able to recognize in others. That's also just more importantly not supposed to be a point of superiority. Everyone's at a different place. We're all different. We all have different soul lessons. We don't we can kind of see where people are at based on like how what their patterns are or whatever. But who are we to know as well? Like maybe somebody needs to learn a certain lesson that's very clear to us, but maybe we haven't learned a certain lesson that's very obvious to them. So there's all sorts of different ways of kind of evolving our soul, and there's a million different paths leading to one of the same place. But that spiritual ego too is one thing that we have to confront as well. And like as we do, I feel our inner work, we can reach different states of being that other people don't have access to. But then our outer work is actually using that to be more of service to others, and not putting and being able to see our similarities between other people, not what makes us different.
Yes, exactly. Because that work truly aligns you also with your quote unquote soul purpose, your vocation, what you're here to do in the real world, right? Let's maybe talk about what we mentioned several times, level of being, to get really better understanding or definition, what we mean by that. And level of being really ties into the process of embodiment, how embodied you are. And embodiment doesn't necessarily mean to be more in touch with your body, which maybe is part to be in the body, but the true meaning is really embodiment really means soul incarnated in the flesh. It relates to, from an esoteric perspective, soul individualization, the growth of the soul. And you see it in all esoteric traditions. They talk about, that we're born with an essence or soul potential we need to bring to the forefront, like in Sri Aurobindo's work or in other Eastern esoteric teachings, that the soul resides behind the heart. It needs to be brought to the front. Mm-hmm. And the personality ego becomes an expression of that. Gurdjieff talks about the necessity to grow a soul, right? So a higher level of being means a person who has a high level of soul integration, which is more in tune with the true self, connected to the divine, and the personality becomes an expression of that. Low level of being is the personality with all the conditioning, wounding, and programming is in charge, but the true essence is hidden behind it. So that's where the inner work comes in. The
mechanical nature too, and patterns.
And that's what most people then mistake for the self and for the true self. Mm-hmm. Like they mistake their personality, their mask, their I they identify with.
Yeah, my desires, my likes, my dislikes.
Exactly. Right? So that's the work from an inner work perspective, but it ties into knowledge and understanding. You have, in order to, you can also gain a lot of knowledge. Like people read a lot and have the intellectual pursuit, but just gathering information, especially from the outside world or about even esoteric literature, just reading and intellectually understanding doesn't, and actually just collecting information, reading and even memorizing doesn't necessarily result in understanding. Understanding meaning having wisdom, embodied knowledge. You apply it, you walk, you talk. Yeah. I can see it in myself at the beginning. I was reading a lot, very intellectually driven, so it was resonating deep level. And I was fooling myself because I thought I understood even certain esotericism or what's going on in the world intellectually, but I hadn't embodied knowledge. I was lacking my level of being to really live it, so to speak. And it's still it's always an ongoing process. Yeah. Right? So you can only come to a higher level of understanding if your level of being determines how much you truly understand in terms of applied knowledge. Yeah. But there can also be the trap, for example, Gurdjieff talks about if somebody's so self-absorbed and just inner work and shutting out the outside world, you can actually reach a high level of being, but become what Gurdjieff talks a stupid saint. Mm-hmm. Like you don't understand the world, you don't even know how to apply it.
Yeah,
right?
Like some people are born psychic, but doesn't mean they have any understanding on how the world works.
Exactly. That's a good example. Just because you're psychic or clairvoyant doesn't mean that you're awake, so to speak, right? You have maybe certain gifts.
Yeah, and I think especially I remember because I got very into yoga and meditation. That was really like my first passion. And for a period, I just wasn't reading any books. And that was also, I could see how that was important for a period. I wasn't reading no books at all, but I wasn't reading the amount of books I read now. And back then I could see how that was important for a period because it was really grounding me in that spiritual practice and that consistency. But then as I realized over time, just doing the yoga and meditation wasn't nearly enough. I also had to be reading spiritual texts that I felt had some good moral guidelines to live by and then applying them to my life. So it's like learning, developing that state. And then almost it's like, I feel like in a way it's almost like reprogramming yourself outside of the external conditioning, because if you're just doing the meditation and yoga practice, then and you're not intentionally creating this kind of sense of inner values that you're going to carry out into the world, then you're just going to go in the world and you're just going to get programmed by the world, because that's going to be what you're going to be presented with. And I think everyone kind of needs just automatically they need some sort of thing in the world to hold on to, and for the most part that's popular culture, and that's what they hold on to. And that almost, interestingly, it's this collective Western value system. It's centered around popular culture for the most part, or it's centered around academia, which is another thing. So I think you really have to develop the level of being to see what resonates with you. And it's like, okay, like I'm going to learn, like, this is a really basic lesson, but I'm going to learn loving kindness, for instance. I'm going to get into a state of being where I can demonstrate that. And that's actually what truly the hard work is, because to practice that in spite of like our fearful conditioning where we want to hold back from people is actually quite difficult. Like it's very easy to do in a very fake way where we're like, oh, this is what it looks like. But in order to really do that with our whole being, really goes against how the world is for the most part. So that's where the real challenge is applying the knowledge we have, and then that creates the understanding, be like, oh, this is how it feels, this is what it's like.
Yeah, and well said. And what you just said about popular culture reminds me what I also call official culture. How so many people like popular yoga teachers, popular spiritual teachers, spiritual authors, right, who present great work, have great insights, but are still very conditioned by official culture and unaware of it. And that, ties into, another issue which we also touched upon. The more popular you become, the harder it is, almost the more your integrity will be challenged, and the more the ego can creep in, the predator mind of just really being more concerned about your social status, your image, your bank account, your career, and all of that. So you naturally then, or not naturally, automatically, people start to censor themselves, right? Yeah. And I've seen this trap in myself. Something when I was questioning, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't talk about this. That might be not helpful. And there's something to be said about external consideration, right? It's not, you also want to be considerate. Yeah. The Goethe talked about strategic enclosure and external consideration. Yeah. Not giving without asking, but this external consideration can be also abused about not speaking out. Yeah. Right. And being a fear of conflict, that's a whole other topic. But I see this a lot in pop, I won't name any names right now, at least not in the first hour here publicly. But some very popular people who share I've shared their work as well, but they believe in official lies, like I talked about this person before, this spiritual author who, justifies Israel's atrocities and is a Zionist, essentially. Or the very popular, a lot of liberal progressive spiritual teachers believe in the lie of global warming, man-made global warming, man-made climate change, which they may trigger some listeners here, but I've written a whole article about it. Don't fall into black and white. I'm not saying that we don't have an impact on the climate, but it's very, very different. There's a whole there's a lot of lies out there, right? Or people, again, especially nowadays, every popular mainstream spiritual teacher jumps on the orange man bad bandwagon, the Trump bashing, right? And not understanding how the matrix on the basic political level even works with divide and conquer and illusory left and right paradigm. And it's interesting, I was invited to a conference, the Berlin Future Forum last year. It was a very interesting conference. I enjoyed it for 4 days. I'm giving my talk, and there's actually my talk is on my website, and an essay I wrote. And the organizer, he invited me also. One of the main reasons people invited purposely people who he said who are not popular, right? And he's a very intelligent, amazing human being and a philosopher, and is really wise and deep knowledge. And I learned a lot from him as well. But he said one of the reasons he noticed the more popular you become, the less you are able to speak out about things that actually truly matter, about taboo topics, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I feel that's just missing that kind of level of integrity, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like a bummer. And I think I'm not implying that every teacher is doing this purposely, avoiding certain topics, but they don't realize how they actually have no understanding and dismiss conspiracy topics offhand without doing sincere research into it, or even more the fringe as deeper occult topics. They dismiss something, exposing their lack of critical thinking, putting their conclusions before their research in all of that. And it's just unfortunate because they have a lot of value and knowledge of their own work, but they're overly focused on the quote unquote inner process and have no understanding of how the world or the matrix works.
Yeah. And that also just brings to mind, I remember at a certain point, it was very essential for my own journey is to give up being popular completely and see that the people who I wanted to reach people who were really sincere, because it's also, I've noticed the more popular you get, the more you just attract people who are just interested into what you're talking about as a novelty thing or as an ego thing. And so that, and that doesn't, honestly, it's not fun to work with those kinds of people, even though you can share information, but there's a huge difference between sharing a technique and being like, wow, this has truly affected me. It's created a complete difference in the way I perceive the world. Often their life starts falling apart around them. But versus someone who just, especially with the topics you get into, the hyperdimensional matrix, it sounds very interesting and this sci-fi thing, and people get this very intellectual curiosity about it. But from my own experience, being confronted with darker forces of the universe was actually extremely difficult to face. And that was, it's extremely hard on a soul level as well. Just as it's hard to go through those difficult soul experiences that bring usually people to spirituality to begin with, confronting these forces externally it's extremely hard on a soul level. It's extremely disheartening. There's an intense disillusionment process that you go through because you see how everything was not love and light and everything was going to be okay to begin with, how there's this really battle between the dark and the light going on in this world constantly, and how it takes constant work and sincerity. And there's a certain point on the path where you realize you have to, I feel like you maybe do or don't get to make a choice, but there's no turning back at that point. And whatever needs to come up internally and externally is going to have to come up. And then you also have to embrace this deep aspect of surrender and not let the ego try and design what it wants for its life, and just be like, I surrender to whatever needs to happen in my life and whatever my true purpose is and whatever that looks like, and giving up all of your dreams and desires and goals, your personal goals, not to say that they may not still come true, but just giving up your attachment to them. And I think for many people, they desire this sense of just security externally and internally. They want to have a big house and a certain amount of children. They want to have this amazing career, and they want everyone to, they want all these things, and I'm not saying that may also come, but it's also about surrendering to this higher power. And I think the more that you go along this journey, the more that you realize that you are not truly in control. Yes, you do have free will, but there's also a divine force which is guiding you, which you have to trust. Did you have a quote to read?
That is actually a perfect segue to a quote I had in mind to read by Sri Aurobindo from his integral yoga teachings. Almost the illusion of quote unquote free will, which is interesting. We just watched, I want to just mention that Netflix film. What was it called?
Bandersnatch.
Bandersnatch. Yeah, it's very interesting where you can
choose your own adventure.
Choose your own adventure. And there's a lot of, for the ones who have a certain understanding of the matrix of reality, of the hyperdimensional matrix and how forces work through us, not only occult hostile forces, but divine forces who actually guide us, and push us to certain decisions and behavior, which we're not aware of why we do certain things. So that was very interesting, but it almost puts a question into, the paradox of free will versus, predestination, so to speak, or fate. And Sri Aurobindo says, the state of ignorance in which you believe that you are the doer of your acts persists as long as it is necessary for your development. But as soon as you're capable of passing into a higher condition, you begin to see that you're an instrument of the one consciousness. You take a step upward and you rise to a higher conscious level. And that's, I think, the whole process of awakening, is to realize that we are transducers of higher energies. And the more we are in our wounded, mechanical condition, self, lower, vital, lower ego consciousness, head-centric, and, have not truly engaged in the embodiment process, the more we're susceptible and influenced by these occult forces, using us like puppets, right? And keeping us in this matrix frequency on an unconscious level. People are not aware of how everybody's influenced by these forces. But the more you rise to a higher level, you transcend these quote-unquote hostile influences and align more with divine will, your true self, right? You become an anchor of this divine frequency, which then expresses yourself in your actions and behaviors and your vocation and your purpose, which is really unique to each of us and different.
Yeah. And I think you start recognizing, those feelings within as your level of being develops. You can feel when something is the right choice. Yes, your mind will also be involved with it, but you get this, and it's not an emotional feeling, by the way. It's not like, all of a sudden your heart's feeling amazing, because emotions also can be highly attached to projections and also hostile forces as well. They can be manipulated by that, but you reach this level of being where it's knowing the truth, and it's a very calm feeling, and it doesn't have any emotion attached to it.
It's often beyond the feeling. It's a deep embodied knowing, which is also not an intellectual thing. It's not a rationalization. And that's almost a topic on its own. But, people always say, just trust your intuition, trust your feelings. But that can be very deceptive. People mistake all kinds of things for intuition, or have all kinds of programmed, reactionary, trauma-based feelings that have nothing to do with the situation, the present moment, so to speak. So it's important too, that inner work to separate, from what is real and what is not.
Yeah. So I think that's a good understanding of our own experiences and insights about spiritual integrity and the importance of this both inner and outer process of understanding ourselves and understanding the world. So we're going to also have the second hour of the podcast, as always. We're going to go more in depth about the importance of understanding the matrix and how that relates to our inner process. And then also, we're just going to give some practical tips, maybe our own experience and how we've gone through the journey of inner and outer understanding of the world, and how you can, and how that may look for you based on our own experience, although it looks different for everyone. And maybe it's just some practical tips on how we apply that to our everyday life. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening. And we hope to see you or have you in the forum, and see you in the next hour. Yeah, second hour again for members. To sign up, go to my website, veilofreality.com. See you there.